Hey everybody, I want to talk today a little bit about leaving the United Methodist Church. And I want to talk a little bit about why I left the denomination after a number of years of pastoral ministry and many years of membership, and kind of the big picture reasons why I left, but also kind of what happened with me and my own story and kind of the craziness, some of it that happened. And I want to share this just because it kind of is a good transition point in my YouTube ministry, but also I know I have friends and people I've worked with who have heard bits and pieces, but maybe they're not really sure what happened. One person told me after our vote about disaffiliation at the local United Methodist Church that I was serving that it was like I went to lunch one day and never came back, and right before Holy Week. So I want to talk a little bit about what happened and go through some of the details. I've been stewing on this, as you might imagine, for a long time, since that was back in like March, I guess. And it's Halloween, Reformation Day, appropriately maybe, the day that I'm filming this. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and I want to start off though with several caveats. One is I'm talking about why I left the United Methodist Church. I'm not saying that you necessarily, if you're UMC, need to leave. I'm saying what I did and why I did it. It's not really my place to say what God is calling you to do or not do. That's something that people have to think through and pray through. Um, Even I know people whom I love and respect, and even some who share many of my own concerns and criticisms, who feel called to stay in the UMC, or some who think, you know, things aren't as bad as I think they are. And so, you know, in all of those cases, God bless you. That's you've got to do what you've got to do, and you're not me, and that's okay with me. So I want to first say that. Um, Not everyone's going to agree with, again, my assessment about how things were. I'm going to try to stay on script a little bit so this doesn't get crazy long. And that's okay. I'm sharing this story from my perspective about my own experience. No doubt the conference leadership that was involved with this, but other people in the local church also who were in different ways involved in the unfolding of the events I'm going to describe. They would, I'm sure, narrate it differently, and they were privy to different conversations I was privy to, and vice versa. We all have different perspectives here. And so, again, I don't need everybody to necessarily agree with me. Even if you disagree with much of what I'm going to say, or just the approach I'm taking, um, maybe there will be, for some people who remain in the UMC, some food for thought about possible reforms to our processes that could benefit the local church. By the very nature of this video, so why I'm leaving the UMC, I'm going to be very critical of the United Methodist Church, particularly much of its leadership. And these problems that I'm talking about, I believe, are widespread, but that doesn't mean I'm saying I believe this is every United Methodist bishop or DS, district superintendent, or pastor, or every conference, even in the United States. Almost none of the criticisms I'm going to mention are going to apply to United Methodist churches outside of the United States, and even within the U.S. The situation does vary a lot, I gather, from conference to conference. And some I think are more healthy, and some I think are more unhealthy. And so I can't speak too much about everyone everywhere. And so that's not really my intent in this video. And finally, I'm going to say, in this video, I'm going to talk about how I believe the American bishops and many United Methodist leaders, including in my own conference, have handled this disaffiliation crisis where churches were trying to leave the denomination. I think it's been handled very badly in many cases, and clergy and churches, I think, have been treated in ways that I believe are dishonorable and just not good, as I'll give some detail later on. But I do want to say, in all fairness, for all of the bishops, for all the conference leaders, even in my own conference, even people that I think treated me in ways that were bad, this was for all of them the first denominational split they've ever had to navigate, just as it was for me. And just as I'm sure there are things that I would do differently in retrospect and how I handled things or when I handled it, I've feel very confident that some of our leaders would say the same thing. Um, we all have the benefit of hindsight now, and so God willing, we won't have any of us have to do this again. But I do think we all, just as it's the golden rule, right? Just as we would want others to as I would want others to assess me from a gracious vantage point, we've got to understand we all had difficulties, including the conference leaders. So while I'm going to be very critical of them, you know, I do admit they were in a difficult position just as I was in a difficult position. So uh, with those caveats kind of out there, I'll start a little bit with my background. At the time of this filming, I am 41 years old, and I have been a United Methodist church member for most of my life. I was confirmed in the UMC when I was 11 years old. I had been attending for at least a couple years before that. And in my teenage years, I did attend other denominations, Baptist and evangelical type churches. But when I was in college, first or second year, I got back into the United Methodist Church and got way in. I was singing in the choir and teaching Sunday school, and ultimately got a job on staff as an intern at the large United Methodist Church I attended. And I think I was 19 years old when I started working for the United Methodist Church, and I've been continuously employed by the UMC as lay staff, as an employee of the United Methodist Publishing House through the bookstore, as a pastoral intern, as a campus minister, and also as the pastor of a local parish church my entire adult life until 3 or 4 or 5 months ago now. So that's been my whole ministry, my whole adult life. I met my wife in a United Methodist church. I was given great benefits and gifts by the United Methodist Church in terms of opportunities for service, opportunities for learning and formal education, friendships that I've made, connections I've made through the UMC. And so, I mean, it's just a huge part of my life. And leaving is not something that I did lightly or gleefully at all. So why leave? There were a lot of sacrifices involved. Why leave? The big reason is fairly simple, and it's an integrity issue. Who we said we were and what we said we believed on paper was not the same as what was really happening on the ground in many parts of the United Methodist Church, and particularly among our most senior leadership. The consecration of Karen Oliveto, or Olivito, I still don't know how she says it, as a bishop, even though she was living in a same-sex relationship, and the failure to uphold church teaching around marriage and sexuality, that was the most headline grabbing or attention grabbing issue. But to me, that was really just one expression of a larger problem of what I call institutional dishonesty. We said one thing on paper in our official documents and our book of discipline, which is church doctrine and church law, and then something different was happening on the ground. Not that they were totally separate. There was a lot of overlap, but there was also an increasing amount of not overlap anymore, of difference, of disparity. So across the church, particularly in the U.S., we have seen this with bishops, with clergy, with boards of ordained ministry, with seminary professors. Our leaders have promised before God and in covenant with other members of the United Methodist Church to do one thing, to uphold the book of discipline, to teach United Methodist teaching, to defend it. And then they did the opposite. Our whole system, as I saw it, was built on this idea of covenant. We make promises to each other, and our trust of each other is based on our keeping those promises, and that's what holds the whole institution together. But people were breaking those promises. They were breaking the covenant they made with God and with us. And for a United Methodist pastor, that's an especially acute issue. If you're not sure you can trust the leaders because of our itinerant system where clergy are moved and appointed to different churches, your conference leadership, your district superintendents, and your bishop, they determine where you live, what school district your kids are going to live in, what job opportunities your spouse may have. There's so much about your life that is in their hands. You've got to be able to trust these people, that they are they're trying their best to keep their commitments to you. And um, and there was a breakdown of trust in the denomination. And the breakdown of trust, I believe, came because people vowed to do one thing and then they did something else. And other people knew they were doing it and kind of turned a blind eye or would nod and wink at it or even cheer that they were doing. Even though they weren't breaking their vows, they were cheering on the people who were. And all of that, I think, contributed to the breakdown of trust. At least that's the way I saw it. There was this disconnect between the UMC on paper and the UMC in practice. And we saw this in a lot of ways. Our ordination vows, promise before God to uphold the doctrinal standards of the United Methodist Church, but in practice, the actual doctrinal standards, the Articles of Religion, the Confession of Faith, the standard sermons of John Wesley, his notes on the New Testament, these things were almost totally ignored and just neglected, disregarded in practice in favor of things like appealing to the quadrilateral or Wesley's theology of grace, which was really more of a kind of ethos than a really concrete, spelled out statement of doctrine with this content, not that. And so there was a fuzziness about our doctrine, what exactly was in bounds and out of bounds. In practice was not always clear, even though it was very clear on paper. And in actual practice, it seemed to me among our leaders there was a just great disregard for what John and Charles Wesley actually taught, and what John Wesley's sermons and his notes on the New Testament actually say about sin, about our fallen nature, about salvation, about the utter necessity of repentance and faith in Jesus, even what he clearly says about sexual morality. All of these things were being totally disregarded, even though we swore an oath to uphold this doctrine. In Wesleyan theology, as I said, there's a strong emphasis on the necessity of personal faith and personal repentance in order to receive saving grace and be justified and sanctified and ultimately to be saved into heaven. And in practice, many of our leaders seemed to be universalists or soft universalists who believe that really there is no possibility that anyone would be eternally damned. And that goes directly contrary to the United Methodist Church's confession of faith, which explicitly endorses eternal condemnation as a real thing. I know of a pastor who, in one of the most prominent churches in my conference, preached that all people would ultimately be saved, universalism. Contrary to our doctrine, nothing was done. I had a seminary professor who denied, well, more than one, but certainly one I'm thinking of in particular, who denied basic tenets of the Christian faith, such as the Trinity, the divinity of Christ. And yet these seminary professors like this, they kept their jobs funded with tithe dollars from local United Methodist congregations. Believers in the pews, putting their hard-earned money in the plates, were helping to fund, in part, these people who were undermining the very faith of the church. And I do think a lot of our troubles in the United Methodist Church did start at the seminaries. I know of another pastor who, in personal conversation that I was part of at a retreat, stated his discomfort with the idea that Jesus was somehow superior to other religious teachers. That's kind of exclusivist, and he didn't really like that. That pastor later went on to become a district superintendent. And it seemed to me that everywhere I looked, much of the reins of authority, especially in recent years, were being put in the hands of people who were what we call theological progressives or theological revisionists. And I mean that in a technical sense. They wanted to revise the inherited theology of the church. And they're the ones that really seem to have their hands on the levers of power and just influence in the conference increasingly over time. There was also, I think, in my experience, a lack of respect for many of our traditions. For example, when we are preparing people for ordination, according to discipline, we have to do this. We ask them these historic questions that go all the way back to John Wesley. This very serious and solemn moment of, do you believe these things? Will you do these things? They ask about, are you going on to perfection? They ask about, your stewardship of your finances and your debt, and these things that John Wesley, you read his writings, took very seriously. But when we would ask those questions, people would kind of chuckle and snicker because there was just such a disconnect between what Wesley was about and where we kind of were as sort of a group with our ethos. Um, so there was that, again, disconnect between who we were on paper, who we were in practice, not just regarding doctrine, but also in terms of our ordination vows. We vow to uphold the liturgy of the United Methodist Church, which is spelled out in the Book of Discipline. It's what's in the hymnal, what's in the Book of Worship. It's part of that great prayer book heritage that we received from Anglicanism. But when you'd go to conferences, when you'd go to retreats, when you go to anything, meetings, the UMC's officially liturgy was almost totally ignored and neglected, usually in favor of something cobbled together, off the internet or something. And this was so widespread; it was just unquestioned. It was just, this is what people do. We ignore the liturgy that we swore an oath to uphold, and it was just part of the culture of paper and practice not being aligned. In our ordination vows, we accepted the Bible as the unique and authoritative standard for the church's faith and life. And yet the Bible, interpreted through the Wesleyan tradition, was not often where we turn to for guidance in practical matters with difficult decisions. I mean, sometimes it was, but I feel like it didn't have the kind of practical authority that it needed to have, really, in the life of the Christian church. And others may see that differently, but that was my feeling. So I was struggling with this. Who were we as the UMC? I'm a pastor. I'm a paid representative of this organization, right? What am I supposed to be representing? Who we say we are on paper, or who we kind of actually are in practice? Which UMC was I supposed to be representing? And I felt like those were becoming increasingly at odds, and that put me in a real bind. So that was a big part of it. You see the disconnect in other ways with our leadership. We had general boards and agencies who were supposed to be advocating in politics and in society at large on behalf of the social principles of the United Methodist Church. But my impression, it seemed to me, they were in fact only advocating for the social principles, those elements of the social principles that kind of aligned with the political left of our country, and ignoring other bits of our social principles that aligned more with the political right. It was like a one-way street. So on something like the legal definition of marriage, or our opposition to partial birth abortion, the social principles are what we would, in American political terms, call more conservative. And the general boards seemed to be totally uninterested in advocating for those social principles. In fact, they were always trying to get General Conference to change them. But they were perfectly happy to advocate loudly and proudly for things that aligned with the left in terms of American political discourse. And again, that felt like just a failure of integrity to do real justice to the actual nuance of United Methodist teaching. And I also felt like, and there's research on this, there was a big disconnect between rank and file people in the pews and these top level type denominational leaders. I've seen a couple of studies on this that have shown that United Methodists in America were more likely to identify as Republican or conservative as opposed to Democrat or liberal, and United Methodists in America in the pews were more likely to hold more traditional theological beliefs than progressive theological beliefs. And yet, with the leaders, all the clergy, but especially the top level leaders, it was like the exact inverse of that. And so money was going, I'm quite certain, to support causes that people in the pews would not support and would not want their money to go to support. The mission of the church is supposed to be to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And that's what our resources ought to be aligned with our mission. And I mean, the last annual conference I attended was heavily focused on kind of a laundry list of what we would probably call American political left type of issues, climate change, congressional redistricting in my own state, identity politics types issues. And I'm not even saying the church should never speak to these things. Um, but the way that it was approached at the conference was completely one sided. I don't think it represented the breadth of views within the state of Louisiana, within the annual conference. And I know many people who were at that conference felt totally alienated and kind of almost not disenfranchised, but um, unrepresented by what was going on there, and yet they were the ones rank and file in the pew who were funding the thing. And I've had numerous people tell me that. I know of a large church in this conference that didn't even start talking about leaving until after that annual conference wrapped up. And there was nothing at that conference about, even though our decline was accelerating our conference in terms of membership, there was nothing at all about making new disciples of Jesus, bringing people to faith, seeing souls saved. Um, didn't come up, you know. So there was all that, and even at that last conference, it seemed to me there was kind of a lack of seriousness about some of our own processes and making sure that things are working appropriately. At the last clergy session, where we vote on who we're going to ordain or whether we're going to continue people in the ordination process, we voted to put forward candidates by round of applause. And this is a room with like a few hundred people in it. And there's no way to know if the candidates got the appropriate majorities required by discipline. But the bishop was like, oh, it's all good. Let's just clap and then move on. And I asked somebody later, did we even validly vote on those people? And this was a colleague, an older colleague. And he looked at me and said, I have no idea. And so it just felt like there was just fast and loose, with our rules, with our doctrine, with our discipline, with our liturgy. It was pervasive, and I view that as an institutional lack of integrity. What we said on paper, what we were doing on the ground, it just wasn't aligning, and it seemed to me this problem was getting worse. Now, up until 2019, 2020, it did look like things were moving in a good direction. The traditionalists were continuously making gains, and the evangelicals and conservatives and broadly Catholic Methodists were kind of making gains at the general conference level, which is the highest decision-making body in the denomination. But after the 2019 general conference, which reaffirmed traditional teachings and put more harsh disciplinary measures in place for people who went against those teachings on human sexuality and the definition of marriage. After that conference was over, theological revisionists declared quite openly that it did not matter what the church taught, it did not matter what general conference decided, they simply were going to ignore it. They were going to resist. They were going to, despite their vows before God, before all of us, in covenant with all of us, to uphold the discipline, to uphold the teachings of the General Conference, they were no longer going to do that. And that was when I really began to have doubts about, okay, where is this thing going? And once a lot of our major traditionalist evangelical leaders started leaving, and major flagship churches, evangelical churches started leaving, that's when my hope, at least for the American wing of the United Methodist Church, started really to fade. That over the last 2 years or so. And one of the things I'm not sure many people have really given much thought to, and it'll be interesting to see how this plays out, is how radical a change that is for United Methodist polity, like how the church is governed. For people to say, hey, we disagree with the General Conference, we disagree with the Book of Discipline, so we're just going to ignore it. And there be no consequences for no longer abiding by church law. Think about the precedent that sets for church governance going forward. If leaders in a local annual conference or in a jurisdiction decide that some new teaching or some old teaching suddenly becomes problematic, or they don't like it anymore and they're just going to ignore it, what does that say about good governance in an institution with millions of people? Are we going to be governed by clear rules that are impartially administered, or are we going to be governed by the whims of whoever happens to be in charge at the moment? And I think that's a very serious question that hasn't been talked about that much. Our annual conference, for all of us, more traditional and more progressive, I'm sure, as well, had become more divisive in recent years, more frustrating an experience for everybody. And I kind of came home after that last one saying, even which one was it? I came home from that conference, I guess the year before, saying, do I really want to spend the rest of my ministry, maybe 20, 25 or more years, dealing with this frustration? And it's only going to get worse as far as I can tell. So those are some of the big issues, and then there was also just how the disaffiliation crisis was being handled in my conference and in other conferences. Excuse me, other conferences as well. It seemed like rules were being applied differently in different places, unequally. Of course, the Council of Bishops, led by Bishop Bickerton, announced that churches outside of the United States could not disaffiliate. I don't know. I don't understand that decision, and it just seemed like an unequal application of the rule of law, and it looked totally unfair on the face of things to me. I know there have been cases in several conferences. I've been told about one case in our conference that I had served in where conference leaders got wind that a small church with big resources and property values was talking about leaving, and the conference leaders invoked special provisions in the Book of Discipline to close that church without the consent of the members and seize all the assets and all the properties. And that that was happening. And again, I was told of one case where it happened here, and it's like, why? If we really believe in Christian charity, if we really believe all the stuff we were saying about blessing each other as we go our different ways, go do good work for the kingdom, why would we do that? In my own conference, as more and more churches started talking about leaving the UMC, it seems pretty clear there developed among the leadership a real hostility toward disaffiliating churches and clergy. And I've had numerous people from several districts in the conference tell me that their DS who conducted their meeting to vote on disaffiliation came across as disdainful or disrespectful. Now, to be fair, I've also heard that in some districts it was very businesslike and, just get it done and be off. And also, to be fair, the people who are telling me that are no doubt perceiving things in a highly emotional moment through the lens of their own concerns and fears and everything at this fraught moment. But I've heard it so many times, I do think it probably was not an uncommon experience. And I think that especially considering other things that I have heard about how some of those meetings and disaffiliations were handled. In some parts of the conference, and certainly this is true in the district where I served, when churches were voting to disaffiliate, the district superintendent immediately deconsecrated the sanctuary or the worship space of those churches, so that it's no longer a consecrated, holy place of worship. Now, why would they do that? I mean, these are not only going to continue to be churches, they're going to continue to be Methodist churches, and until their disaffiliations are approved by the annual conference, which in some cases was weeks or months away, they're still going to be United Methodist churches. And yet the district superintendent is deconsecrating the worship space where many of these people were married or baptized their babies or buried grandma and met Jesus. It just seemed like, and I don't know I'm sure there's some technical or legal justification, but it just felt like a slap in the face. In fact, so much so, when I first heard that was happening, I did not believe it. I was like, this is a rumor that some conservative, speaking out of their fear has started, because that did happen. And I actually made some phone calls, talked to some people who were at some meetings, and had it verified independently from multiple sources that was in fact happening. And I that floored me. That struck me and others as a real abuse of spiritual authority. And it absolutely gave the lie to all the lip service we were giving about blessing each other as we go our different ways. At least that certainly is what it looked like to me. And it really hurt my trust in my bishop and my district superintendent and the conference leadership around our state when I heard that was happening. There are a lot of other petty things that were going on as well. And that's what it looked like. It looked just vindictive. Like, I'm just doing this The conference leadership is just doing this because we're mad, um, and we want to hurt you. I mean, that's what it looked like. They were making churches turn in all their United Methodist hymnals, most of which had been given in honor of, family members or departed loved ones or children or whatever. And of course, the crazy thing about that is, like, a church the day after the disaffiliation is finalized can go on Cokesbury.com and order a whole crate of new hymnals, United Methodist hymnals with a cross and flame on them. Cokesbury's not going to not sell those to you because you're not a UMC member. So it just felt, again, it felt unnecessary. It felt vindictive and punitive. And what is the conference going to do with a warehouse full of hymnals, given in loving memory of Aunt Susie? It just, there was a lot of stuff like that seemed like hair splitting technicalities to kind of try to stick it to people. And it just, it really was disappointing. But even with all that going on, I have tried multiple times in the last years, because I've had people complaining to me about the conference leaders. I've tried to balance between being honest about, yeah, I think this is pretty terrible, but at the same time, this is their first split. I'm sure they're stressed out. I think way more churches are leaving than they expected. I think they're in a place of just being totally blindsided, and they're filled with anxiety, and that's leading them to be kind of tight-fisted and trying to be very controlling of everything, which is actually just pushing more people away, and like it's making things worse. And I was telling people, we've got to keep praying for our leaders, because this is a hard season for all of us, and it has been. And we should keep praying for each other, because that's what Jesus calls us to do. That's in the Bible as well. But yeah, the way that the conference leaders acted, it did push more people toward disaffiliation who had been kind of on the fence. And certainly I saw that with my own story, which I'll share a little bit of next. So those are some of the big reasons I decided to leave. And there are others. I don't want this to be a 4-hour video, but there are other things I could mention, or other things I could go into more detail about. I want to share some of my experience that really made it impossible for me to stay. So in the spring of 2022, a year and a half ago now, I encouraged my church to take a look at what was happening in the denomination, my local UMC congregation. And I primarily did this through a YouTube video I published on April 1st called The UMC Split As I See It, and also just through conversations with people. And I told my congregation that I thought we were going to see more sort of canonical disobedience of people disregarding their ordination vows, disregarding the covenant they made with us and with God, and disregarding what they swore to uphold. I thought we were going to see more of that going forward. I thought we were going to see more bishops elected who were living in same-sex unions, or in or openly encouraging clergy to celebrate those unions, which was also illegal under church law. And I'd say the jurisdictional conferences from later in 2022 have vindicated me on that score. But as a pastor who interacts with people from across that whole congregation who didn't all necessarily interact with each other, they weren't all necessarily in the same, friend social groups or whatever, I was convinced that a solid majority of our most active people, a solid majority of our leaders, a solid majority of our biggest givers, wanted to leave the denomination. And I do believe subsequent events have vindicated me on that score as well. So April 1st, I put out a video trying to inform people about what was going on with the UMC split, trying to do it in a calm and gracious way. I did this primarily for my church members, though I knew other people would probably watch it. I thought maybe I'd get a few hundred views. I was floored by the reception. Up to the point of this filming, it's had over 79,000 views. That's by far and away the biggest video on this YouTube channel. I wish some of the more positive stuff would get that many views, but in any case, that's the world we live in, right? We had our first public meeting for our whole church, and anyone else who wanted to come, I was told later. There was a lot of times this happened where we did something and I kind of was told you shouldn't have done it that way, but I didn't feel like I had a lot of guidance. So all of our meetings are open. We've got open hearts, open minds, open doors, open meetings. And so we had people from other churches and from the community come to that first meeting. until we were told by the DS that future meetings had to be members only. And we notified the district superintendent about that meeting, as was appropriate for us to do. And that was on May 15th, Sunday afternoon. That morning, I preached a sermon called Loving One Another Through a Denominational Divorce, which is also on YouTube. You can go watch that. May 15th of 2022. The other one was April 1st. The district superintendent came to the meeting, and she basically kind of ran the meeting, which, as I saw it, was her prerogative. That was within her purview. She was our district superintendent. But she did make some assertions that were factually untrue, and I think potentially inflammatory. At that meeting, she said that conservatives had added language to the Book of Discipline stating that homosexuality was an abomination. And I asked her where that was, what paragraph number, and she just kind of said, "Oh, I'm sure it's in there." After the meeting, of course, I checked on it, and it's not in there, and I pressed her about that. And to her credit, she sent a correction email that we tried to get out to as many people as we could that were at that meeting, but of course, we didn't keep a list of everyone who came to that open meeting, and so we did the best we could. I should also note that the district superintendent that we were interacting with had been the pastor of that congregation, not immediately before me, but the one before that. And so I think that in all kinds of ways affected how this process played out from her side and from the church's side as well. Probably not for the better, but maybe different people think differently about that. Without much really clear guidance about the discernment process, I was trying to guide it at first, and then the bishop and the district superintendent told me that's not appropriate for you to do. So I handed it off to our lay leader and our church council chair, who were publicly kind of on opposite sides of this, or at least that's the way they were perceived. So that kind of, I think, was a good thing. We had a church council meeting at the end of September, I think is when it was. I haven't gone back to review all the dates. The DS attended that meeting, and this was an open forum, like a kind of a church town hall almost, where different people were invited to share their thoughts. The DS again spoke to us at that meeting and suggested that very few churches were moving toward disaffiliation that she was aware of. And this was fairly early on, so it was definitely fewer than the 165 or so that did end up leaving from Louisiana. The meeting, we had lots of people talk about it, and at the end of that meeting, the church council voted in principle to hold a vote on the disaffiliation question, but they also voted to delay that vote to give people time to kind of get their heads around the decision until early 2023. So this was September, so we were looking at sometime in the spring semester of the next year. After that, things really started to get divided, or at least maybe it was already that way, but that's when it became apparent. Things were feeling more and more divided. It felt like there was a clearly emerging kind of stay camp and leave camp. There were rumors. Both camps were kind of falling into sharing things that turned out not to be true or not entirely true, and I tried as best I could to deal with that with people privately. Our leadership team, we were having trouble agreeing on how best to proceed with this big block of time we had. And we decided around that time, I think it was late September, early October, to hire an outside professional consultant who had no skin in the game to facilitate a discernment process and bring us to the point of having that vote. So we hired a fellow named Mike Gamble from the Auxano group, who in my estimation did a amazing and fantastic job in the midst of a very difficult situation. He endured a whole lot of unpleasantness with great commitment and professionalism and very little grumbling or complaining. And I cannot say enough good about Mike and the Auxano group and just the professional quality they brought to that and the wisdom that they tried to offer us. It was clear that about 2/3 of our church council wanted to disaffiliate, but about 1/3 wanted to stay in the UMC. And we saw that division in the decision around hiring the consultant. I supported hiring Mike primarily because he could start working with us immediately. late September, early October. And given how divided things were becoming, I did not think it was a good idea to just let stuff fester. Um, and so that was one of the points in this process where I was vocal, where I said, I think we ought to do this. Um, and there was another, I would say, strong candidate that was whose name was in the running, who was someone I know personally, who was recommended by the conference and was doing discernment processes with other churches. But he was not able to start working for us for like 3 months or something. Um, and so we went with Mike. But the way the division and factional spirit, I'll say, was kind of at work in all of us, I'd say. That was seen if Daniel or the majority wants to hire Mike, that must mean Mike is going to push us toward a disaffiliation. And of course, the ironic thing about that is the other guy, that the people who wanted to stay kind of were advocating for, he led the discernment process of one of the, I guess, three largest churches in our conference that did vote to disaffiliate, while Mike's process with us did not lead to the United Methodist congregation voting to leave. So I think we were all just kind of getting mixed up by that factional spirit at that point. And so that's what was going on. This was also about the same time my child was born. So from this point forward, I'm getting a lot of sleepless nights, not just because of stress, that too, but also because I got a baby crying all night and I'm foggy headed and probably not as clear thinking as I could be. But it was shortly after, if memory serves, it was shortly after we hired Auxano Group to facilitate this process that I was notified by my bishop that a member of my church had filed a formal complaint against me. And this was the first formal complaint I received, and which most people probably in my community never knew about. I took pains to keep it quiet out of concern that if more people knew about this, our already divided situation was just going to be totally inflamed. Just crazy. So this initiated a disciplinary process, which would either resolve the complaint through what is called a just resolution that both parties agree to, where theoretically we're both given ground on some things, or it would go, if we couldn't reach a resolution, then a committee on investigations would be asked to look into it to see if there was grounds for a church trial of me, a formal ecclesiastical trial. And potentially remove me from the ordained ministry. So because I was under complaint, I knew that at any time I could be suspended and removed from the pulpit just by a decision from the bishop and other top leaders. And I was determined. I wanted to see the discernment process through. I thought it would be bad if somebody else came in midway. And so I did make some compromises just to get that just resolution done and get the process over with. And I had a number of very uncomfortable meetings with my bishop, usually with the assistant bishop and the complainant there, and usually a clergy advocate with me and another person sitting with the complainant, the person who brought the complaint. And I didn't know much about our disciplinary processes. I learned a whole lot over the last year. The complaint against me was that basically boiled down to I encouraged the church to consider disaffiliation, and this had caused a bunch of division and harm to the church. And I did encourage them to prayerfully consider if they wanted to disaffiliate, because the truth was, and I saw my job as to tell the truth, churches were leaving now, at that time. I told them I did not believe that they would get another opportunity to leave after the 2024 General Conference, after paragraph 2553, which was the provision allowing people to leave in the Book of Discipline. After that expired at the end of 2023, I told people I strongly suspect that will close the door on this possibility. So if you ever want to do it, you need to look at it, you need to think about it, you need to pray about it now. We'll see if General Conference 2024 vindicates me on that point as well, but I suspect getting out will be impossible, or at least very, very difficult going forward. But my basic position going into this complaint process was like, disaffiliation is a provision of our Book of Discipline, so it's impossible for it to be a violation of our Book of Discipline for me to encourage people to consider it prayerfully. My bishop, on the other hand, saw, I think, a different point of view on this. Like, any discussing of that or in any way encouraging it was kind of disloyal And so that's the way she approached it, and I think that shaped the way this disciplinary process unfolded. I never heard what she thought about her fellow bishops who were openly disregarding church law. She didn't say anything about that in terms of keeping loyalty. At one of these meetings, the subject of my April 1 video came up, and the bishop told me she found the video to be offensive and filled with misinformation. Uh, I asked her if she could give an example of something that I said that was factually untrue, so I could like edit the video or add a note or something. And her response to me was, "Well, nobody has time to go back and write them all down." And so this kind of making the accusation of misinformation without a single concrete example sort of reinforced to me that the charge of misinformation was really just being used to shut down discussion. And it did heighten my own distrust, I will say, of my bishop, which shaped how I interacted with this process. At that same meeting, the bishop said that my video showed that I did not support the UMC's position on abortion in the social principles, which the attentive viewer of that video will note is not something I ever said. And I told her that, and everything I said was perfectly compatible with the social principles, which she ignored, and then went on to say, "If you do not believe our social principles, perhaps you should not be a United Methodist pastor," which was not the only time I was pointed toward a door, I have to say, in this process. But I was totally flabbergasted because I was literally the only person sitting at that table. On that day, it was the bishop, the assistant to the bishop, and the complainant, and me. I was the only person sitting at the table who did believe our social principles and their teachings about marriage and human sexuality. So I was literally speechless and didn't have the wherewithal to point that out. So I shared the details of the complaint with a retired district superintendent whom I trusted. This person was not an apologist for the Global Methodist Church or the Wesleyan Covenant Association. He planned to stay in the UMC and encouraged me to do the same. And someone I saw as a genuine centrist. And when this person understood the details of the complaint, this former DS said, when I was on the cabinet, we would have dismissed this out of hand because it's clearly frivolous and there's definitely not enough there for a church trial. And that's really kind of reinforced my sense that the bishop was using this process to try to quiet me down, and at least that's the way I perceived it. As I said, I did make some compromises just to get the just resolution done. For a couple of months, I took down the UMC split as I see it video, and I also took down the video of the sermon, Loving One Another Through Denominational Divorce. And that was a hard pill for me. Honestly, it felt like A, a disgruntled church member and my bishop were taking my voice away, and B, taking down a sermon called Loving One Another Through this difficult process. To me, that was like everything that was wrong with everything that was happening, and the factional spirit that was developing in us and among us. There were plenty of other difficult and uncomfortable meetings I had with my overseers in the church, with church members. I had difficult conversations, had angry letters, name calling, sometimes anonymous name calling, rumors that I had to deal with, that my staff had to deal with. This was so hard on them. But long story short, we finished our discernment process. We had surveys, we did town hall meetings, and the church council decided to go ahead with a vote, even though the survey results strongly suggested we did not have a 2/3 majority that you needed to disaffiliate and leave the denomination. We thought we would have a majority, but not a 2/3. We had the vote on the last Sunday in Lent before Palm Sunday, and it was really kind of surreal. As pastor who'd been there for 7 years, to have people I'd never laid eyes on coming out to vote, people who lived out of state coming out to vote. It was crazy. And at the end of the day, our survey results were pretty good. We had a majority that wanted to leave, but it was a bare majority. It wasn't close to a 2/3 majority. And that meeting was handled by the district and conference leaders in a way that I think is fair to say did not help to de-escalate the emotions that were already running high. Certainly that's what numerous people told me. And after that meeting, I told my staff they could take the next day off. It was Monday. We were all just exhausted, emotionally in every way, spiritually. I got a text message from my district superintendent on Monday telling me on Tuesday morning I needed to be at the bishop's office to meet with the bishop. And this was now a new bishop. One of the crazy things about this process and my conference and many others is we had a Episcopal elections in the middle of things, which was, I don't know if it could have been avoided, but I think it was not fair to those new bishops, and it just made things even more complicated already. But so I had a meeting with the new bishop. It's the first time I've ever met this woman, and the district superintendent. And for the second time in space of about, I guess, 5 or 6 months, I kind of tried to bring someone to sit with me at the meeting as kind of an encourager, an advocate, or just to kind of second set of ears to make sure I'm hearing everything right. And I was told that, just as I had been told in the fall at my first meeting, this is a supervisory meeting and you're not allowed to bring anybody. And so after another night of my baby crying all night and me being stressed, I went to the meeting and sat at the table with the bishop, the district superintendent, the assistant to the bishop, and they all three, mostly the district superintendent, but all three were asking me questions, in some cases accusations framed in the form of a question. And I can't peer into someone else's mind, so I don't know exactly what they had talked about before, but it felt to me like their overarching concern was that I was going to basically launch a new Methodist church in my community after the disaffiliation vote failed and take a bunch of people with me. And I get why that was a concern, because that had happened in other places in the world. And that seemed to be a lot of what they were grilling me about. I knew there were people in my congregation who were talking about forming another church, and I had heard that was going, those kinds of discussions were happening. But anytime anybody sort of brought the subject to me, I told them, look, I'm a United Methodist pastor in this community. It's inappropriate for me to be a part of any conversations about launching a alternative church in this community. And so I tried to stay out of that. My district superintendent and other people in the room asked me questions about specific conversations I had had with individual church members, conversations that I regarded to be as of a pastoral nature. And I was evasive with them because I literally had no idea how to respond. It never even occurred to me that my district superintendent or my bishop would be asking me to divulge conversations of a pastoral nature that I'd had with one of my church members. And so I was like not responding directly to them. Of course, they took my evasiveness as a sign of dishonesty, or at least I think that they did. I can't peer into their heart. The DS at one point asked to read text messages from church members. But there was a whole lot of, in that meeting, like, what did you know and when did you know it kind of thing. And I think it's also worth noting that my district superintendent had been an attorney before going into pastoral ministry. And I definitely felt like I was being cross-examined and just on my back foot the whole time. And again, I had nobody there as an advocate with me. It seemed pretty clear to me that they thought, again, I was going to try to launch an alternative Methodist church. And I told them point blank, I had no intention of doing that. I wasn't going to do that. I had no plans of doing that. And I guess they thought that I was lying to their face and that I was a person without integrity. And for the record, I want to note that I did not do that, and I have moved out of that community. There were other accusations, questions about stuff going on with members of my staff that was kind of based on hearsay, but neither the bishop nor the DS nor anyone ever actually tried to talk to the members of my staff to like hear their side of things or to get a more complete picture. They were mad about emails that church members were sending to each other that were discussing things that the DS didn't want them to discuss. And again, there was like an attempt from the conference leadership to try to control what lay leaders were doing in the church. And in this case, it was an email exchange I didn't even know existed. But I felt like I was being treated like I was culpable, that it was happening. And it was truly the most uncomfortable meeting of my whole life, not to mention my career. I mean, I felt like some kind of like, domestic terror suspect or something who had been interviewed by Homeland Security. I mean, it was extremely, and maybe it was just because I was exhausted, but it was extremely distressing meeting. So if anyone is still watching this video who's planned to stay in the UMC, I think an area where there really could be reform that could get a lot of support is creating some kind of provision in the Book of Discipline that allows any pastor who's summoned to a meeting with their bishop, if the pastor feels it's warranted, they always have the option to bring an advocate with them. So it's not a pastor feeling like they're being cross-examined and ganged up on. And I just think collegiality, and I think should include that option. And I think you could get a wide support from people across the theological spectrum for that kind of reform, to allow pastors to always have an advocate if they feel it's needed. So I was floored coming out of that meeting. I called a retired pastor who was a friend and confidant and told him what I was thinking. And I felt there was no place for me in this conference if they thought I had no integrity. And so I told him I was gonna thinking about drafting a letter to my bishop requesting a leave of absence so that I could transition out of the denomination. I got home, talked this over with my wife, went back to the office, talked it over with a member of my staff parish relations committee who happened to be there, which is the sort of personnel committee that oversees those kinds of conversations, personnel issues. So that was Tuesday afternoon after I'd had that meeting in the morning. Finished up my day at the office, went home. Next morning, I had a coffee meeting with my youth ministry director. Had coffee with him. He's a professional counselor, and I've valued his advice greatly through this whole process. Then I went into the office mid-morning and fired up my computer. I was thinking about how I want to phrase this letter asking for a leave of absence. This is Wednesday morning. Maybe I could send that on Thursday, possibly Friday if I really need to wordsmith it, whatever. Got settled in, checked my email, and saw that I had received an email the previous afternoon, like 4:15, 4:30, like end of the day, from my bishop, letting me know that after my meeting with the bishop, the DS, and the assistant to the bishop, from that meeting, a formal complaint had been filed against me, and I was immediately suspended from my ministry. Not much was given in the way of further instruction, so I called a former UMC colleague who had left the denomination, who knew a lot about these disciplinary processes, and just said, what am I supposed to do? What are the protocols? Who can I talk to or not talk to? And so I left the office, went home. Hour or 2 hours maybe later, I got a phone call from my youth director that I'd seen that morning, and I passed the phone to my wife, and she told him I couldn't talk because I was suspended. And he said, I know. I just heard about it from somebody I work with in the schools, and who already knew about it. So apparently, this was something that flabbergasted me again about this whole process. Somebody at the conference office, I guess, was talking to laity in my church about my suspension, and people in my congregation knew about it, apparently even before I knew about it, certainly before my staff parish relations committee chair knew about it, before my staff knew about it, that was just something about this whole thing that was just crazy to me. But another thing that was crazy was, they suspended me 36 hours before I was going to submit a letter asking for a leave of absence. If I had gone on leave, my departure would have been on my terms. There wouldn't have been any bad guy in the situation, and the local church would not have been on the hook, as I understand the rules. They would not have had to pay my salary. They wouldn't have had to pay my benefits. They wouldn't have had to continue to provide free childcare for my daughter. They wouldn't have had to provide the housing at the parsonage. In fact, I was going to offer to pay rent to the church so that I could stay in the parsonage until my daughter finished kindergarten, because we didn't want her whole kindergarten to get upended by this. But instead, because they suspended me, the church had to pay for all that. And I think worse than that for the local church, once word got around about my suspension, my staff resigned in protest, and within a week or two, about 100 members had withdrawn their membership from the local congregation. And this is just one of many points where I felt like decisions that were being made beyond the level of the local church, the conference level, the jurisdictional level, the general conference, the general commission on general conference, the judicial council, all of these groups had made decisions that kind of coalesced to create this crisis, which was harming the local church. And they delayed General Conference, but then they didn't delay the exit date for churches. And then there were reports that there were shenanigans about delaying the General Conference. They didn't even really try to have it on time, and all this stuff was happening like higher up the chain, denominational stuff, and it was harming the ministry of the local church. And that's one of the big reasons why I left the UMC. And I saw my own suspension, I think, was just another example of that. It seemed like the leaders were just listening to kind of one side of what was going on in the local church. They didn't have a complete picture of where people were and what people were feeling and what kind of emotions were running high. And I think they made a bad call because of that. So my family attended Palm Sunday services at the Episcopal Church where my wife and I were married. We that week attended a Seder meal at the home of a friend, and the local Roman Catholic priest very graciously invited us to their Maundy Thursday service, and for my wife and I to have our feet washed at this really time when we were hurting a lot. I was suspended right before Holy Week. It was crazy. And of course, I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody or coordinate any of the changes we had to make to the schedule or anything like that. We went to Easter service at Holy Cross Anglican Church. We went to a big non-denominational megachurch, both of those in Baton Rouge. Another week after that, I attended another Roman Catholic church in the area one week where I had heard the priest there had seen my YouTube videos like 2 years prior and had been an Episcopal priest and had been praying for me and my family and saying masses for us. Never even knew this guy. So we went to his church and met him. But it was really weird, I have to say, going through Holy Week without preaching, without stepping into a pulpit, without celebrating the sacrament. It was kind of surreal. It was very hard. Within a couple weeks, I had my meeting with the bishop to review this new complaint that was made against me. It included charges that basically kind of fell into three sort of general areas. One was that I'd mishandled the membership records, and as a matter of fact, we actually hired somebody to do a comprehensive membership audit, probably for the first time in the 180-year history of that church, maybe, comparing two different digital rolls with our physical books, and I think we went above and beyond what most churches in our conference did to try to get our membership rolls as accurate as possible. There were 10 or 12-ish people of the 300 odd that showed up to vote that were not on the list that the conference people had, a list we submitted to them. And I only know for certain who one of those people were because he told me he was left off the list, and the DS also mentioned it. And I went back and checked the actual email where we sent our list to the district office, and he was on the list we sent. And so if that was part of the complaint, I can't speak to the other names. I can only speak to his. But that was not an error on our end. That was on the district's end, apparently. They said they didn't have his name. We sent his name. The other thing about improperly handling membership rolls, we had removed some people from our membership rolls a year or two prior to all this, and it was alleged that we had not gone through all the appropriate disciplinary steps, of which there are many, before we removed them. And I honestly told them in that supervisory meeting that without going back and looking at the committee minutes and talking to the person who was really kind of running that piece of it was part of our vision process that we were doing, cleaning up the rolls, doing new outreach. There was a whole lot of things we were doing under an umbrella of a new vision for the church. And so without talking to the person who was kind of running that piece, I couldn't say for sure that we didn't skip any steps. I mean, I thought we had done everything appropriately, but maybe not. And that would have been a violation of the discipline if we had failed to do that. Again, I didn't have the opportunity to investigate that. But even if we did, that would have been my fault, violation of the discipline. But I don't think they usually suspend people from their ministry for that. And I will never be persuaded that 2 days after our vote to disaffiliate, I was yanked from my pulpit because of an improper administrative process 2 years prior to that. I don't think that was the actual reason, and nobody thought that was the actual reason who knew about it, which wasn't many. But There were a couple of complaints that I, again, as mentioned, did not control what my staff and my lay leadership were saying and doing in private email exchanges and stuff in the run up to the vote. And look, I did communicate the district superintendent's um, request or requirement that people not talk about this stuff, but I did not police it. I didn't feel I had the time or the energy to do that, and I didn't have the inclination to do that. I don't know if that is an actual violation of the Book of Discipline. I doubt that it is, but I guess we'll never know because it's not going to church trial. And then finally, there were a couple of complaints that basically I knew people were talking about forming a new congregation, were interested in doing that, were actively thinking about doing that, making plans, and I neglected to inform my district superintendent, which, as I told them, as far as I know, that is not a violation of the Book of Discipline. I don't know of any requirement that says I have to, in this situation, you have to do that. And so again, I guess we could have had a church trial to find out, but it felt to me like it was a totally kind of trumped up thing. So because the meeting was part of a formal complaint process, I did have an advocate at this one, and he was a retired pastor who had been involved in my process and some other processes because this was happening with some other people in the conference as well. And he strenuously objected to the way that the bishop was handling all this and the way I and other clergy were being treated. So we left that meeting, and according to the process, we would then be contacted about a follow-up meeting to meet with the accuser and to start the just resolution process. Based on my experience with the previous complaint in the fall, I expected that to take place within a week or two. But I never heard from the conference leadership about setting a date for that meeting. In fact, I don't believe I ever heard from them again until I submitted a letter signaling my intent to withdraw from the membership of the annual conference several weeks, maybe even a month and a half later. And after a few days and not hearing anything, my thought was, I guess they're just going to kind of run out the clock on me because according to the Book of Discipline, they had 90 days to reach a just resolution and could extend it out to 120 days. And the cutoff date for when clergy withdrawing from the denomination was going to be before that. So I think they just kind of figured Daniel's going to leave the denomination. They certainly pointed me toward the door, and so they didn't really need to pursue the process because the clock, I would leave before the clock ran out. But in the meantime, the local church was paying my salary. I was on suspension for a couple of months, and they were paying my salary and paying my benefits and all the stuff. And that did reinforce to me how just I think the UMC system doesn't serve the local congregations well. I know sometimes it does, and I've seen it work well, but certainly in the last couple of years, it seemed like just things were not working right. And in my own case, I have had multiple, and I mean multiple families tell me, and I'm talking about young families, families with little kids, families with children and youth, tell me, Daniel, we were kind of on the fence about this whole disaffiliation thing. We were probably just going to stick with the local United Methodist congregation, but between how the disaffiliating vote meeting was handled and then your suspension, that just totally alienated us and just pushed us out. And so we left. I've had I've had several families tell me that. And again, I think decisions that were made beyond the local level harmed the local United Methodist congregation. And the leaders in my conference, if they had tried to get broader input from more voices within the local church to really understand what was going on a little better, maybe they would have understood that, while certainly I wasn't perfect and definitely made some decisions that I would make differently if I had it to do again, thanks be to God, I don't. I think most people in the church saw me as trying to be fair, spiritual, Christ-centered, and leading with integrity through a very difficult season. And then it looked like I was punished for that. I know other traditionalist-leaning clergy and at least one district superintendent in our conference who were also suspended, and many of us were left with the feeling that the conference leadership was just kind of on the rampage, on the warpath, like targeting more evangelical traditionalist people sympathetic toward disaffiliations. So that's what happened. And this is a very long video, but I want to just close out here um, by noting a couple ways that even in the midst of all this difficulty, God was at work, and it was amazing. God was at work to help me grow, to maybe get a little bit more courageous and learning to deal with things that I would have shied away from in times past, or say things that I would have not said in times past. I think God helped me grow as a man, as a person, as a Christian through all of this, and as a pastor as well. Certainly, God used this whole situation to launch a new church in the St. Francisville community, of which I am not the pastor. But also, through it, people from the old church who had kind of drifted away got reactivated. And for them, I think that's a good thing for their own spirits and their own growth. Um, and so I told people at the end of this whole thing, there were more Methodists in church on Sunday mornings than when I was the pastor in that community. And that's a good thing. And that's the way that God worked it for his good. I found prayer warriors and supporters I never knew I had. I mentioned the Catholic priest who was praying for my family for like a year or two. I got a couple of different notes from Baptist ministers in other parts of the state that like knew somebody who knew somebody who knew me. I didn't know these people. They were praying for me. Their prayer teams were lifting up our church. I mean, it was amazing just the way that God was reassuring us through this process. We were blessed financially, actually, surprisingly, maybe through this whole thing. We just had lots of gifts and blessings financially in that area of our life. Just like God is providing, and there was no doubt, and that helped us really be at ease as best we could, and not be totally freaking out through this whole situation. And then we were blessed to come back to Gina. I'm now serving at the Nolly Methodist Church here in Gina, Louisiana. It's the church I served immediately prior um, to going down to St. Francisville. And this is a free and independent congregation, Methodist congregation. And I'm also helping with the Bela Methodist Church in our community as well. And this is an awesome time to be in ministry here in Gina. I mean, we are growing. Our children and youth ministries are just booming like probably not in 50 years. I got here and got to immediately almost baptize some youth who were professing their faith in Jesus for the first time, committing their lives to Christ. Um, we adopted the historic Methodist Articles of Religion as our faith statement. We're kind of getting the business side of the church together so that we can get on with the business of sharing Christ with our community, with our families, with our children, with hurting people in this broken world. So if you're in central Louisiana and you're looking for a place to come, we'd love to welcome you at the Nolly Church, or if you like to go early, at the Bela Church in the Gina, Louisiana area. We're grounded in the Bible, the ancient creeds of the early church, the classic universal Christian tradition with the solid Methodist and Wesleyan theology. That's who we are, and we'd love to welcome anybody who wants to come. Other ways that I just give thanks to God for the way things have worked out. Our kids are doing well with the transition. We've just been blessed in so many ways. And at the end of this ordeal, I have to say, and this is so true, you read about this in people's lives, but I've seen it in just a bigger way than I've ever seen it before in my life. My faith in the God who provides, my faith in the goodness of God, my faith in the God who can work things together, my ability to entrust myself to his goodness is stronger now than it was 2 years ago. And for that, I am very thankful. If you've stuck with me this whole time, I'm also very thankful for that. It's a very long video. As always, feel free to share it or hit the thumbs up button, subscribe if you want to hear more. Probably not too much more about the UMC stuff, but I do want to remind everybody the UMC and is still going through a tumultuous season, and will be, I think, for at least a couple general conferences. And the leaders and the people do need all of our prayers. And so I hope everybody will keep that in mind. And also the churches that have left and are moving into new seasons and starting new things, and in some cases joining new denominations or discerning what denomination or if any they need to join. Those folks all and those clergy all need our prayers as well, including me. I've got some exciting things in terms of where I'm going next that I'll talk about in a future video, God willing. Until we connect again, may the Lord bless you and keep you. Amen.